Melody and the situation involving Martel and Ariane, and I just don't agree with that narrative. Melody went through real betrayal and emotional pain in her marriage, and instead of acknowledging that, people try to twist it like she was somehow the problem. She wasn't. She was a woman dealing with cheating, confusion, and heartbreak, trying to understand her own relationship, and at the end of the day, she came out of that situation, rebuilt her life, and is focusing on her children and her peace, which deserves respect. Now when it comes to the broader commentary around Tasha K and the way these stories get discussed, it feels like some bloggers will say anything for attention, and it often ends up minimizing the real emotional experiences people went through. There's also a bigger point about accountability and behavior. When actions repeat over and over, you can't keep calling it accidental because patterns show intention. Shifting over to Real Housewives of Atlanta, this season actually feels more refreshed because we're seeing real-life struggles instead of just surface-level drama. Michelle has definitely stepped in and changed the energy by being direct and calling things out as she sees them, especially when it comes to Portia, who often comes across as self-focused in conversations, sometimes shifting attention back to herself even when others are sharing personal or serious issues. That's something people are finally starting to notice more clearly. At the same time, I do give credit where it's due. Michelle handled the situation directly instead of gossiping, and that's how you address conflict head-on. Cynthia and others have also acknowledged when things were out of line, but consistency and accountability has always been an issue in that group dynamic. Then you've got Drew, whose situation still feels unclear and inconsistent in terms of her relationship and living arrangements, which is why people keep questioning what's really going on. Shamia's situation also shows that support in relationships isn't just about money, but about emotional backing and showing up, and that seems to be lacking in some areas. What's actually interesting this season is that we're finally seeing real-life struggles, business setbacks, financial stress, health issues, and emotional rebuilding. Angela dealing with real estate losses, Pinky facing bankruptcy stress, and Michelle dealing with health challenges all bring a layer of reality that makes the show feel more grounded. At the same time, some friendships feel very surface level, because if a friendship can't survive honesty or correction, then it probably wasn't that solid to begin with. Overall, the theme this season feels like accountability, people having to own their choices instead of constantly rewriting narratives when things don't go their way. And that's really the part that stands out the most this season, how people respond when they're actually held accountable. Because it's easy to be cool when everything is light and fun, but the moment someone checks you or brings up something uncomfortable, you start to see who can handle real conversation and who can't. That's why Michelle's presence is shifting things. She's not afraid to say things directly, even if it creates tension. And whether people agree with her or not, she's forcing conversations that would normally get brushed under the rug. With Portia, it's becoming more obvious that her communication style often centers her own experiences, even when someone else is opening up about something serious. That doesn't always come from a bad place, but it does show a lack of awareness in certain moments, especially when timing matters. And that's where the criticism is coming from, not just what was said, but how and when it was said. In group settings like this, emotional intelligence matters just as much as the words themselves. Drew's storyline also continues to feel unclear, and that lack of clarity is part of why viewers stay confused. When someone is constantly shifting between explanations, labels, and situations, it becomes hard to follow what's real and what's just being avoided. And with Shamea, you can see ambition and business drive, but the disconnect in support at home raises questions about how stable things really are behind the scenes. These dynamics matter because they shape how people move, speak, and make decisions. What's actually working this season is that the show is leaning more into real consequences instead of just arguments and shade. We're seeing people deal with financial pressure, business risks, emotional stress, and personal growth in real time. That makes the content feel more grounded and less performative. Angela's rebuilding, Pinky's legal and financial stress, and Michelle's health journey all add layers that feel more human than manufactured drama. At the same time, It's also exposing how fragile some friendships are when there's no real foundation underneath them. A lot of these relationships only seem strong in controlled environments, but when honesty enters the picture, things start to shift quickly. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it just shows what's real and what isn't. Overall, the direction of the season feels like a reset. It's less about polished image and more about what people are actually going through. And whether fans agree with every cast member or not, it's clear that the show is finally leaning into more authentic storytelling, where actions, consequences, and accountability are all part of the conversation instead of being avoided. And when you really zoom out on everything happening this season, it also highlights how differently people handle pressure once they're no longer in control of the narrative. Some cast members are clearly adapting by being more open, showing vulnerability, or owning their situations, while others seem more focused on managing perception instead of addressing the core issues directly. That contrast is what keeps the audience engaged, because it shows real human behavior under stress rather than just rehearsed moments for the camera. It also brings up an important point about growth versus repetition. Growth is visible when someone acknowledges patterns, makes changes, and actually shifts how they respond in similar situations. But when the same conflicts keep reappearing in different forms, whether it's communication issues, relationship confusion, or friendship tension, it starts to feel like unresolved cycles repeating themselves. And that's why viewers often question what's real progress versus what's just temporary resolution for the sake of the show. At the same time, accountability doesn't always land evenly across the board, especially in group settings where loyalty, history, and personal alliances influence how people respond to each other. Some people get called out immediately, while others are given more grace or deflection, depending on relationships within the group. That imbalance is part of what fuels tension, because audiences notice when the same standards aren't applied consistently. Still, what makes this season feel different is that even with the drama, there's more emotional substance underneath it. You're seeing people deal with real consequences, financial recovery, health battles, emotional healing, and the pressure of maintaining public image while privately struggling. That duality makes the storytelling feel more layered, because it's not just about conflict anymore, it's about what happens after the conflict. And in that sense, the show becomes less about who is right or wrong in every moment and more about how people evolve or don't when their lives are under constant visibility. That's why conversations around honesty, accountability, and emotional intelligence keep coming up, because they're not just part of the drama, they're shaping how people are being perceived long-term. So overall, this season doesn't just feel like entertainment, it feels like a reflection of how people navigate real-life pressure in public spaces, where every choice, reaction, and silence ends up becoming part of a bigger narrative whether they intend it or not. And that's exactly why the audience reaction has been so strong this season, because people are no longer just watching for entertainment, they're watching for authenticity and consistency. When viewers feel like they're seeing real emotions and real consequences, they engage differently. They start analyzing patterns, questioning motives, and comparing how each situation is handled across the board. That's part of why accountability keeps becoming a central theme in the discussions surrounding the show. It also highlights how storytelling shifts when people are aware of public perception. Some cast members seem to lean into transparency, even when it's uncomfortable, while others appear more guarded, carefully shaping how they want to be seen. Neither approach is automatically right or wrong, but it does change how audiences interpret their actions. Transparency tends to build trust with viewers, while overcuration can sometimes create skepticism, especially when storylines feel inconsistent. Another layer to this season is how conflict resolution is being portrayed. In earlier seasons or older formats of reality TV, conflicts often stayed unresolved or were dragged out for drama. Now, there's more emphasis on direct conversations, apologies, and immediate reactions, which makes things feel more realistic, but also more intense. Because when issues are addressed in real time, there's less room for narrative control afterward, and that can expose true emotions more quickly. At the same time, it's important to recognize that everyone is dealing with different pressures behind the scenes, even if it doesn't always show up clearly on camera. Financial stress, personal growth, health challenges, and relationship transitions all affect how people show up in conversations and conflicts. That context doesn't excuse behavior, but it does help explain why certain reactions or decisions happen the way they do. What ties everything together this season is the idea that perception and reality are constantly competing. What people present publicly isn't always the full picture, and what viewers assume from edited moments isn't always the complete truth either. That tension between what's shown and what's experienced is what keeps the conversation going long after episodes air. So as the season continues, it's likely that these patterns will become even more noticeable: who grows through their experiences, who repeats cycles, and who adapts to the pressure of being constantly observed. And ultimately, that's what makes this era of the show feel more layered. It's not just about drama anymore. It's about how people evolve when their lives are unfolding in public view. And continuing from that point, what also stands out is how the audience itself becomes part of the narrative in a way. People are no longer just passive viewers. They're actively dissecting moments, replaying conversations, and forming long-term opinions based on short clips or edited scenes. That means cast members are not only dealing with each other on screen, but also dealing with public interpretation off-screen, which adds another layer of pressure to everything they do. This is why misunderstandings can spread so quickly, because once a moment is taken out of full context, it can be reshaped into something entirely different. And depending on who is speaking on it, the same situation can be framed as growth, conflict, jealousy, or misunderstanding. That fluidity in interpretation is part of what keeps these discussions constantly evolving, even after the episodes air. At the same time, there's a noticeable shift in how realness is valued. Audiences are responding more strongly to moments that feel unfiltered or emotionally honest, even if they are messy or uncomfortable. That's why direct conversations, confrontations, and vulnerable admissions tend to resonate more than polished, controlled interactions. It creates a sense that what you're seeing is closer to reality, even if it's still shaped by production and editing. Another important dynamic this season is the idea of consequences extending beyond the immediate moment. It's not just about what happens in an argument or a scene, it's about how that moment impacts relationships, reputations, and future interactions. Once something is said or done publicly, it doesn't disappear. It continues to circulate, get referenced, and influence how people are perceived moving forward. Another layer worth noting is how personal growth is often unevenly perceived. One person's attempt at growth may be seen as genuine progress, while another's similar attempt may be dismissed or questioned, depending on their history with the group. That inconsistency in reception is part of what fuels ongoing tension, because audiences and cast members alike start evaluating actions through the lens of past behavior rather than present intent alone. At the same time, the season continues to highlight how communication styles directly impact relationships. It's not just about what is said, but how it is received, and whether there is space for understanding in the moment. Miscommunication, interruptions, and shifting focus during emotional conversations often create ripple effects that extend far beyond the initial discussion, shaping trust and future interactions. What makes this particular cycle of storytelling more engaging is that it doesn't offer easy resolution. Instead, it shows that accountability, healing, and growth are not linear processes. They are ongoing and often messy. People revisit old patterns, attempt new approaches, and sometimes fall back into familiar behaviors under pressure. That realism is what makes the narrative feel more grounded, even when the circumstances are heightened for television. Ultimately, what this season continues to demonstrate is that visibility changes everything. It amplifies emotions, accelerates conflict, and forces reflection in real time. And whether viewers are watching for entertainment, analysis, or emotional connection, they are all engaging with a version of reality that is constantly being shaped by perception, reaction, and memory. And as that idea of visibility continues to shape everything, it also becomes clearer that the pressure isn't just on the cast, it's on the entire structure of how these stories are received and interpreted. When every moment is instantly clipped, reposted, and debated, The original context often gets diluted, and what remains is whatever version spreads fastest. That's why conversations around intent versus perception become so important, because the gap between what actually happened and what people believe happened can grow very quickly in a media environment like this. At the same time, the emotional impact of these situations shouldn't be underestimated, especially when real personal history is involved. In cases like Melody's, for example, the public conversation often moves far beyond the lived experience